And I just want to be really honest as we get started today that I'm not a professional counselor, I'm not a therapist, I'm not a psychologist, but getting to today, I've actually talked to several of them because what we're gonna talk about today has the potential to be really hard. And it's one of those things that we just wanna navigate really well. And if I'm honest, it would just be easier for us just to avoid this whole topic today. But if we're going to experience what it means to truly be a life changed by Christ, to experience the life that he has to offer us, we kind of sort of have to go where we're going today. And today we're talking about what do you do when you don't know what to do, but you do know that you're at the bad end of others' bad choices. What do you do when you're at the bad end of others' bad choices? And today we're gonna look at someone whose life seemed to be spent almost entirely at the bad end of others' bad choices. And in the opening book of the Bible, it's called Genesis, and his story is actually one of the longest recorded stories. They dedicate 12 full chapters to his life and to his journey, and some scholars actually argue that he is one of, if not the only character in all of the Old Testament who doesn't have anything negative recorded about him. I mean, as I was reading up on this guy's life, the only thing that I noticed remotely negative about him was that he might have been called a tattletale as a kid and a little bit naive with what he shared with who, when. But I want us to get to know this guy. So I want us to turn to Genesis chapter 37, and it's on page 31 of the Bibles in our seat. So Genesis 37, page 31 in the Bibles in our seat, because when it comes to asking, what do you do when you don't know what to do, but you do know you're at the bad end of someone else's bad choices, this guy gets it. Now, I want us to get to know Joseph, but I love calling people by a nickname, so I'm just gonna refer to him as Joe, because Joe makes me feel like I get to know him a little bit more. So I want us to get to meet Joe for the very first time tonight. So Genesis chapter 37, page 31, and we'll just get started right in verse 1. So hopefully you guys have found it by now. Page 31, Genesis chapter 37. So Jacob, that's Joe's daddy. So Jacob, Joe's daddy, settled again in the land of Canaan where his father had lived as a foreigner. This is the account of Jacob and his family when Joseph was 17 years old. That's a really important detail. Joe is only 17 years old when all this starts. He often tended his father's flocks. He worked for his half-brothers, the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zelpha. But Joseph reported to his father some of the bad things his brothers were doing. He could have called him a tattletale at that moment. Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other children because Joseph had been born to him in his old age. So one day, Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe. But his brothers hated Joseph because their father loved him more than the rest of them. They couldn't say a kind word about him. So that's our introduction to Joe. Joe is 17 years old. His daddy loves him more than the other 11 brothers, and Jacob's favoritism turns all the brothers against him. Jacob actually gives Joe a fancy multicolored coat. This is the source of all of the brothers' frustration because he gave the brothers nothing. Jacob treated Joe so different, so spoiled, that the brothers couldn't even say a nice word about him. I mean, Joe's just a kid. He's just living in his dad's home. He didn't ask for his brothers to hate him, to be jealous of him. He didn't cause the dysfunction in his home, but he's the one at the bad end of others' bad choices, and he's about to start personally facing the consequences of those bad choices. Because one day, his brothers are way out tending the sheep, and dad goes, "Hey, Joe, go check up on your brothers for me." So Joe starts wandering around the desert from town to town, tracking down where his brothers and the flock had migrated to, and he finally catches up with them, and he sees them way off in the distance, and due to his fancy coat, his "daddy loves me more than you" coat, his "I'm the favorite son and you're not" coat, the brothers saw him coming way off. They saw him coming a mile away. And as he got closer, the more furious they got. They had been so hurt by their dad's favoritism, so bitter, that by the time Joe got there, they grabbed him, they ripped his fancy coat off, and they threw him into a pit. And Joe, the 17-year-old kid, he's terrified. I mean, he's just been roughed up. He's been thrown down a hole, and all he knows is this is where his story is gonna end, that he's going to starve to death in this hole in the middle of nowhere on the backside of the desert. all alone. So now Joe, the product of a dysfunctional home and its trauma, is now personally fearing for his life. He's been betrayed and backstabbed by those who should have been loving him, protecting him. I mean, he's only 17 years old, and his flesh and blood, his older brothers, have totally turned on him, betrayed him. He thinks he's about to die in this hole until out of nowhere, a traveling caravan of traders come by. And they just come rolling through, and the brothers decide not to personally kill him, not to have his blood on their hands, but to still make some money on the side from him and to get rid of him and accomplish all that they're hoping for. And so they decide to sell Joe into slavery. To sell Joe into slavery. They make up this wild story about how they found his bloody coat destroyed by a wild animal in the desert to appease dad, and then they just wash their hands of their younger brother, betraying him and selling him off. Joe's only 17 years old, and he's been shackled and drug away from his home, thrown into all the horrors of ancient slavery. I mean, he has no dignity, treated like cattle and property, used and abused, and no one really cares if he lives or dies just as long as he keeps working. Well, Joe gets drugged to Egypt. And to make matters worse, Egyptians at this time hated, despised, wouldn't even eat around filthy Hebrews. And Joe is a dirty, filthy Hebrew, and he is now brought as a slave into this racism and this tension. And eventually he's bought by this wealthy Egyptian, an Egyptian who is an officer to Pharaoh. He happens to be the captain of the palace guard, a guy named Potiphar. And Potiphar's a really big deal. He's a mover and a shaker, and his voice matters, and he has a lot to manage. And well, Potiphar notices this young servant kid who seems to be making things better wherever he goes. Whatever he touches seems to succeed. And we're told that it's actually God who's given Joe all this favor and helping him and blessing him. And well, Potiphar, he doesn't know who God is, but he does know when something is working well. And he puts aside all of his racism towards this dirty Hebrew slave, and he invites this Hebrew slave into greater responsibility and leadership. And eventually, Joe, the dirty, hated Hebrew slave, becomes second in command in Potiphar's house. Well, not only had Potiphar just noticed Joe, but so did his wife. But she didn't see someone doing good. She saw someone looking good, and she decided to start chasing after him. Well, Joe starts running from her. He knew that some fun with her just wasn't worth losing his life over. Well, she keeps chasing and he keeps running, and eventually she gets so mad, so frustrated that she can't get what she wants, that her slave won't obey her. She finally makes up this huge story, and she throws all types of accusations on him, all types of accusations pointing the finger at him, accusing him of things he just didn't do, questioning his character, his intention, his trustworthiness. She throws such accusations against him that all that he has scraped and clawed for in his life is just instantly ripped away from him. The lies stick. And somehow, by the grace of God, he's not killed on the spot, but instead, he's thrown into prison and locked up behind bars, trapped, dejected. His hands are tied. He's voiceless and powerless to change anything. And Joe is yet again on the bad end of others' bad choices. And as far as he knew, this was where his story would end. In a cell, forgotten, voiceless, nameless, accused, and apparently cursed. But Joe did what Joe does best. He started making things better, started making a difference where he was. And this time it wasn't Potiphar noticing him, but it actually was the prison warden. And God yet again started working through Joe in the worst of the worst situations. And slowly Joe went from being a nobody in the prison to being a somebody in the prison, and yet again started to rise to influence and leadership as a prisoner in the prison. Well, as he's starting to make the most of this trapped situation, he's still thinking this is where he'll spend the rest of his days. Until one day, two guys get thrown in, two important guys, the king's cupbearer and the king's baker. And they did something to make the king mad, and so the king just kind of reactively threw him into prison. And well, one night as they're all sleeping in the prison, these two guys have these really vivid dreams. And And they just can't shake the dream. And the next day, they start talking about these dreams and they start asking, can anyone interpret our dreams, make sense of our dreams? And so Joe hears them talking about their dreams and he says, hey, only God can interpret dreams. Only God can do that. But then God gives him the ability to interpret their dreams. And so he tells the cupbearer, hey, your dream means that in 3 days, you'll be returned to favor. And when you go back to the Pharaoh, back to the king, can you remember me? Can you tell the king about me? Can you get me out of here? I don't deserve this. And the cupbearer's like, oh man, yes, I am your ride or die for life. I got you, absolutely. I will remember you, I've got your back. Well, the baker hears all this like bromance going on, and he's like, I want in on this good news moment. And so he asked for his dream to be interpreted, but Joe had a very, very, very different news for him. He tells him that in 3 days, his head would be cut off, he would be impaled, and birds would eat his flesh. Not exactly what he was hoping for. Well, sure enough, both of those things is exactly what happens. The cupbearer is restored to the king and the baker is executed. But when the cupbearer gets back to the king, the cupbearer totally forgets him. Totally forgets about Joe. The cupbearer is just looking out for numero uno and he completely snuffs Joe out. Basically, he just lies straight to Joe's face in the prison and completely forgets about him. And Joe, he should have been advocated for, promoted, celebrated, but he was totally passed over. And yet again, all Joe knows is that this is where it's gonna end. This would be the end of his story. Well, Joe's story isn't over, and there's a reason why there's so many chapters to his story, because eventually, 2 full years later, the Bible actually drives this point home by saying 2 full years. Like Joe is stuck in prison, unjustly accused, thinking this is how he will die in misery for 2 more full years. After 2 years, there comes another vivid dream. But this time it isn't the cupbearer having a dream, it's actually Pharaoh. And Pharaoh can't shake it. And he wakes up just like the cupbearer did years earlier, and he has to have someone interpret this dream, but he starts asking around and no one around him can answer it. And that's when the cupbearer who's near the king is like, oh yeah, there was that one guy, that one moment. Oh, that Hebrew years ago in prison, that guy, he interpreted my dreams and it all came exactly true. And well, Pharaoh's like, get the dude, I need him, get him here because I need some answers. And the Bible makes a point saying that when they went to bring Joe to see the king, that he had to intentionally be taken to get a shower and a shave because of how bad he looked. He needed a serious glow up because of how bad he had been treated for so long in prison. Joe was so dirty from all those years in prison, he wasn't fit to be seen outside the prison. And so Joe finally gets glowed up, makes it to the king, and the king asks if he can interpret dreams. And he says the same thing to the king that he says to the cupbearer and the baker earlier. He says, only God can interpret dreams. But then God helps him interpret the dream. And Joe tells the Pharaoh that the dream means that they're about to have 7 amazing years of crops followed by 7 awful, awful, absolute years of famine. And he had been warned. And he needed to make the right allocations and preparations now or they would all be dead in 14 years. And so Joe, just in the moment, kind of rattles off a quick plan of possible ideas. The king is totally taken aback about this idea. And he's so impressed by what he's hearing from Joe. He does something just astounding, like pretty amazing. He makes Joe second in command. And basically he's like, you then figure it out. Like this is now your job. You're the second in command. You solve all this problem. And at first when we read this, we're like, yay, Joe, he's arrived. He's second in command. He's out of prison. It all makes sense. All that pain makes sense. And we want to celebrate him. Until you start to realize he's just put in possibly one of the most overwhelming, impossible leadership positions a person could be thrown into. He is the dirty foreigner that all the Egyptians hate. And now he's having to tell them what to do based upon some dream he interpreted. And he's got to lead people who don't want to be led by him or by the likes of him. And he's got the weight of knowing millions of lives are at stake and on his shoulders. And he's also got that nagging thought. What if I was wrong? What if I messed this thing up? This is all on me. I mean, he knows that he's got to knock this leadership challenge out of the park or he's going to get knocked out for good. He is totally dumped on in this moment. So just a recap of Joe's not so great life so far. Daddy issues, check. Dysfunctional family, check. Betrayal, check. Loss of dignity, false accusations, trapped, powerless, forgotten, lied to, passed over. totally dumped on and given unrealistic expectations and demands? Check. If anyone has ever been at the bad end of others' bad choices, Joe's our man. He's experienced so much hurt, trauma, injustice. Like, I can't even start to imagine this guy's life. Well, God continues to bless Joe, and he actually rallies the nation, and he leads them through 7 amazing years, creates such a surplus of crop that they can't even count how much they have. And just as he predicted, the famine comes, 7 awful years, 7 years of nothing. And he is now in the position of the keeper of life and death. And he must determine who gets food and who's gonna starve. And he has to navigate hungry, desperate mobs and crowds. And then on top of leading a nation through crisis, all the surrounding nations start to hear there's food in Egypt, and they start pouring in. And so now he's not only leading through a domestic tension and crisis, he now has to suss out who is coming from these foreign nations, coming out of desperation, asking for a handout, and who's coming as a spy. Who's coming to look for a way to invade and to take it all for themselves? Because desperate people do desperate things. And I just can't imagine the strain and the stress that he's under, the sleepless nights, the anxiety in it all. And it's in the midst of all of that tension and all of that stress and all of that anxiety, he sees them. 10 men coming through the crowd of millions, coming for help. 10 men that as he looked at them, they looked strangely familiar. They reminded him of something forgotten, something long ago. And as they come close and they bow down before him, that's when it hits. These men are the same men who started it all. These are the men who threw him in the pit, who sold him into slavery, who are the source of all this pain, all this trauma, every tear, every terrified night, every moment of pain and anxiety. And now those men are bowing before him, begging for salvation, for food. And these men, they're his 10 brothers. Man, if I was Joe, I would have totally freaked out on that moment. I mean, I would have demanded their heads. I would have let decades of pain and trauma just come pouring out of me on them. And I would have used all my power to get all my revenge executed right then. I would have so made them pay for every single offense. But this is where my jaw drops at Joe. He somehow or another in that moment keeps his composure. And he starts working this plan that chapters later unfolds with his entire family being reunited and provided for and cared for under his care. And they move to Egypt and they survive the famine. And ultimately, this family becomes the lineage that our faith is rooted in. And Joe rescues and serves and provides and cares for his really messed up and broken family instead of getting his personal revenge, instead of paying them back. And at the climax of his story, after all of these chapters of unfolding the story, his family has finally moved to Egypt. They survive, and eventually Jacob, the father, the patriarch of it all, dies. And the brothers, after the funeral, finds themselves without daddy to protect them. And they throw themselves yet again at Joe's feet and beg for continued provision and protection and for him to not retaliate now that good old dad is dead. And in that moment, Joe says these now famous words that can become an anchor for us when we're asking, what do we do when we don't know what to do? But we do know we're at the bad end of others' bad choices. Somehow, in that moment, he looks to his brothers and he says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people. You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many. How did he say those words? I mean, how is that his response in that moment? I mean, how does a person who has experienced so much pain and trauma look at the people who started it all and have that as a response? And that's the million-dollar question for today is we're asking, what do you do when you don't know what to do? But you do know you're at the bad end of others' bad decisions. And that's why I said at the beginning, I'm not a therapist or a psychologist, but this week I've been talking to a lot of them. And I just want to highlight some of the profound things that Joe says in this sentence, things that if we apply them to us might just help us arrive where he did. And so let's just start. He said, you intended to harm me. You intended to harm me. I mean, Joe starts off by acknowledging the truth. And here's what's so amazing about that. He acknowledged the truth of his situation. He acknowledged the who and the what of his pain, the who and the what of his pain. And sometimes we find ourselves on the bad end of others' bad choices and somehow move our resentment and our hurt and our pain from that person and what they did to like a cloud of people, to a big group of people, from a you to this nebulous, uncontainable them. And our pain from this person becomes magnified because it subconsciously grows from one person hurting us to everyone like them hurting us. I mean, we see this all the time. These are silly examples, but a lady gets lied to by a guy, and the guy is now like, all ladies are liars. Or a guy cheats on a girl, and now she thinks all guys are cheaters. Or, you know, in my story, a popular kid makes fun of you, and now you think all the popular kids are mean and spiteful. Or one Republican says something dumb, and you're like, all Republicans are dumb. Or one Democrat pushes your buttons, and you think all Democrats are going to push your buttons. I mean, how many of us have been hurt by one person or one small group of people, but now apply that hurt, that vengeance, to a much bigger group, to an entire people group, to everyone who looks like them or talks like them or votes like them. And I mean, when we do that, that's where racism starts and sexism starts and classism starts and things get wildly out of hand. I mean, how many of us are accidentally magnifying the effects of our pain of that one person because we lost track of the truth of our pain? Something happens. Something happens when, and healing starts to happen when we acknowledge the truth and we look back and we identify our who and our what they did. When we start to strip away all the extra layers of compounding hurt and discover the original who and what. Now, all of that extra compounding hurt and pain and trauma, all of that still matters, and we need healing from that to occur. But it seems that when you go back to your original who and what and hold them accountable for who and what, it seems to kind of like pull the plug on the rest. When we acknowledge the truth, it starts to give us power back, clarity back. It helps us to start to see what we're dealing with and start to see a pathway forward. Now, how you respond to your who and what, whether you talk to them directly like Joe did, or if you need to set up an empty chair and pretend they're in it, I mean, that decision, that's why you need wise counsel in our lives, because sometimes we do need to address the person. We do need to go talk directly to them and say, you did this. But sometimes we can't do that. Sometimes we just shouldn't do that. I mean, maybe they've already passed or you can't talk directly to them. And then there's moments that we need to heed Jesus's warning to not throw our pearls before swine. I mean, some people just do more harm, more damage if we talk to them. And wisdom actually requires that we pause and ask, is it best for us to talk directly to them, or is it wiser for us to address them within ourselves? But we can all start by acknowledging the truth. We can state our who and our what and hold that person responsible and not everyone else like them. But Joe doesn't stop there. And what Joe does next is one of the biggest leaps of faith many of us will ever choose to make. His next statement is profound. He said, but God. He addressed his who and his what, but then he has this incredible perspective shift and he says, but God. I mean, Joe has a perspective shift from his pain, from his vengeance, from the justice that he is owed, and somehow he turns from all of that pain to God. I mean, it's so easy in my hurt to only see my hurt, to only see my pain, to only see the wrongs that have been done to me. It is so easy to only see what I am owed and what's due to me, what I deserve. But when we choose to turn and have that perspective shift and to trust God, to say, but God, man, that profoundly turns our eyes from fixating on our pain to looking at our Savior. Looking at our healer, looking at the one who is capable of making a difference, looking at the one who comes close and cries with us and comforts us, who is intimately aware and knows our pain, who is not naive of what we're feeling, but is fully aware of it. I once heard that in our pain, we find ourselves with blinders on, blinders that only allow us to see the pain directly in front of us, and that because that's all we see becomes all that we can feel. But that turning to God, that intentional perspective shift pulls the blinders back to expand our horizon, to see options, to see help, to see his loving hands reaching to care for us. But that turn, that perspective shift, I mean, it's the pivotal point for Joe, and it's a pivotal point for us. And after this profound, pivotal perspective shift, Joe lays on us this incredible, profound truth. He said, but God intended it all for good. God intended it all for good. God does this weird thing called redemption. One of the biggest and most heated theological debates is around God's role in suffering. And we could talk for years about all the nuances of that. But in the midst of all of these debates, what I have had clarity beyond clarity on, and what I can say with so much confidence, is that God is good, and he wants good things for our lives. But at the same time, there's also evil that hates us and wants evil in our lives. And because God can't force us to choose him, because you can't force love, there's this cosmic battle between good and evil over our souls, over our affection, over our trust, our well-being. And there's moments that God in his weird God way will strong hand his will. And then there's other moments that it just seems like evil runs rampant. But the verse the verse that has become my personal anchor in all of my pain and all of my trauma and my own heartache, the verse that I cling to as I've rushed to ERs to meet with parents and terrified families, the verse that I cling to as I sit with people crushed under the consequences of others' bad choices, the verse that has provided me so much hope is Romans 8:28. It says, and we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God. And we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God. It doesn't say that God causes all things. It doesn't say that God doesn't cause the pain, the trauma, the wrong for you to be on the bad end of others' bad choices. But it very, 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 very clearly says God causes everything to work together. He doesn't cause everything, he causes everything to work together. To work together. I mean, he has a way of taking our pain, our brokenness, the wrong, the messed up things, and taking all of that junk and all of that hurt and all of those broken pieces and like a master jigsaw puzzler, figuring out how to work it all back together for good. And if I'm honest, I don't know why my family had a traumatic car wreck. I don't know why my dad became an addict. I don't know why I was bullied as a kid and why I broke my back. And I don't know why all the other junk that has happened to me and to my family has happened over the years. I don't know why. But what I know beyond a shadow of a doubt is that God has a way of working it all out. And I've been blessed to have a couple of glimmers of seeing how he's worked it out. And I'm trusting that he will continue to work it out more in the future. And some of us, if we will just pivot and have our but God perspective shift and then trust in his redemptive plan, we'll start to see glimmers, start to see hope of how he's piecing it all together and putting it back. I mean, some of us, we can't see it because all we can see is what our blinders have limited us to. And we're trapped, head down, staring at our pain. And God is so lovingly tapping us on the shoulder and inviting us to profoundly and vulnerably trust him with our pain and to turn to him and have a but God moment. And then and only then will we get to start to see how he's slowly working out his plan of redemption. How the pieces all come together, and it's amazing. It's amazing when we're gifted the grace of seeing how it all works out on this side of heaven. But I promise you this, even if we don't get to make sense of it in our life, and we never see how God is gonna use that pain, and I wanna promise you, in eternity, when you stand next to Jesus, he will stand next to you and he'll start connecting the dots. And he'll pull back the curtain of what he's been doing. And he'll say, this is how I took all your pain, all your trauma, all your hurt, all the bad decisions, all the bad things that were on the end of others' bad decisions, how I took all of that and I stewarded it and I cared for it and I tenderly worked with your pain for a much bigger purpose. Can you start to see it now? But until that moment, all we can do is rely on God. Hold to God. Cling to God. And we have to choose. If we're gonna hold on to our pain and our right to get even, or if we will empty our hands and turn our heads and take hold of the hands of Jesus. Because when we do, we start to see how God's grown us. And maybe, just maybe, we'll start to see purpose in our pain. Start to see purpose in our pain. So Joe does this incredible thing where he says to his brothers, you intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many. Joseph acknowledged the truth of who and what. And then he had this incredible, profound perspective shift of turning to Jesus, looking to God, looking for how he is working a redemptive plan beyond our wildest dreams. And he relied on God. And as he relied on God, he started to grow. He started to find purpose in his pain. It all starts with us acknowledging the truth. It all starts with us looking for God's redemptive, having a but God pivot, and then trusting God's plan. So what do you do when you don't know what to do, but you do know that you're on the bad end of others' bad choices? Man, maybe take a lesson from Joe, whose life seemed to be spent almost entirely at the bad end of others' bad choices. Maybe acknowledge the truth. Maybe have a but God perspective shift, and maybe trust God's plan. Because no matter what our emotions might be telling us right now, God really does love us. And he really does have a good plan for our lives. Let's pray. Jesus, I cannot begin to imagine all the stories around LCBC. All the stories of hurt, all the stories of dysfunctional homes and betrayal and abandonment and being passed over and being given unrealistic expectations, all the ways that we have experienced pain and trauma. I cannot even begin to wrap my head around what our church feels. But Jesus, I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that you are good and you are loving and you are kind and you are desperately pursuing us. And so God, I pray that we'll take a lesson from Joe. We'll acknowledge the truth. That we'll go back to the original who and what. And then that we will profoundly have a but God pivot, turning from our pain, turning from our right to get even, turning from our vengeance, and pivoting to you, having a perspective change. And then as our perspective shifts from our pain to you, that we start to trust your redemptive plan. And God, I pray that for some of us, you will give us the incredible, incredible gift of seeing how you've used our pain for your good purposes. But for those of us who won't get that gift on this side of heaven, I pray that your peace that passes all understanding will fall upon us, and we'll rely on you and cling to you and keep trusting you because you're a good dad with good plans. Jesus, we love you. We thank you and we trust you. And it's in your name we pray.